It seems like this is the 16th of these lecture series, of these lectures we've had this year to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the History of Technology and Science program at Iowa State, the first PhD program in the humanities at Iowa State in its history. This lecture, like all the other lectures, are sponsored both by the History of Technology and Science program, the History Department, the Miller Fund of the LAS College, and the Committee on Lectures funded by the GSB. Today we are fortunate to have a speaker from Ithaca, New York, Rachel Maines, who has a doctoral degree from Carnegie Mellon University. She's taught at various places, including Clarkson University, and is the owner of Maines and Associates, a museum collections management that catalogs and inventories repositories in 23 different states. She is also now the technical processing assistant at Cornell University's Hotel School Library in Ithaca, New York, and her book, The Technology of Orgasm, Hysteria, the Vibrator, and Women's Sexual Satisfaction, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 1998, has won the 1999 Herbert Faze Award of the American Historical Association, a very prestigious award, as well as the Biennial Book Award of the American Foundation for Gender and Genital Medicine and Science. Her topic tonight is Vibrators and Viagra, the double standard in sexual technologies. Rachel?
Obviously made for a taller person. There we go. That's better. Well, I'm delighted to be here tonight. I thought I had better warn everybody here that while I've had a very, very nice reception at all of the places that I have spoken in the last year and a half since this book has been out, that some of the state universities at which I've spoken have had trouble, like, calls from state senators to the president of the university. Why did you allow this notorious person to speak on your campus and things like that? So, but Alan wasn't worried. He thought that, look, we got a little feedback here, I think, right? You hear that high-pitched, is that from the microphone or is that something else? I think that, the slide projector. Well, let's turn it off a moment. You're right. We'll turn that back on later. Don't you worry, you'll get to see the dirty pictures. Don't leave yet. Okay. The topic that I have taken for tonight's talk was suggested to me by some of the strange phone calls that I have received. As you might expect, if you write a book called The Technology of Orgasm, you're going to get some kind of strange phone calls, letters, emails, and so on. Some of them of the sort, my boyfriend says that such and what, and can you tell me what to say? And some of them of the scholarly kind, and some of them, very interestingly, in my experience, from people who are involved in the retail or even manufacturing side of what one might call the sexual products industry. I, in fact, was invited down to Austin, Texas last fall, where a public relations firm was representing a local chain of women's sex toy shops in a state in which vibrators and dildos are in fact illegal. It's illegal to sell them. It's not illegal to own them. It's illegal to sell them, and it's illegal to own more than 6 vibrators or dildos. In Ohio, it's 5. The threshold is 5. Now, if you are wondering how the legislators arrived at these numbers, we can only speculate. But in fact, you're not allowed to own that more, because that would suggest an intent to sell. Now, you may wonder, how could there be a local chain of sex toy stores in a right in the state capital of a state in which it's illegal to sell these things. Well, it's illegal to sell vibrators or dildos if they are intended for the purpose of stimulating the human genitalia. So what you have to do is to pretend that that's not why you're selling them, which is, of course, what, as you will see, what vibrator sellers, I don't know so much about dildo sellers. We'll get to the difference later. Important, you better take notes on that. That will be on the quiz. What is the difference between a vibrator and a dildo? And that's not a joke either, although, well, I guess it sort of is. But in any case, we will make the distinction. Don't you worry. So anyway, I was down in Austin, Texas, and the way that they do this is that they simply say things like, oh yes, I took one of those home myself and it was very effective. You know, it doesn't say for what. You know, I mixed my margarita with it and it was very effective. Now, you may wonder about this because on the one hand, you can go into places like the Rite Aid and you can buy vibrators, perfectly good ones, and I'm sure that most of the people who buy them are buying them for sexual stimulation, but they don't say on them anywhere that that's what they're for. So that's legal. You can do that. And strangely, you could go into these same places and buy penis pumps like the Rite Aid. That's fine. That's not illegal to sell things like that, even in these states where it's illegal to sell vibrators. There are 6 states where there are restrictions on the sale of vibrators and dildos. And of course, these are sex aids, of course, that are used primarily by women. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. Why is it that you can buy a penis pump that says right on it that it is a penis pump, and in the Rite Aid, and you can buy a vibrator, but it won't say which you might actually use it for. It says on it that you're going to, you know, it's good for the back of your neck, or, you know, I don't know, your shoulders, the small of your back, but they don't say anything about the genitalia. Now, I had another interesting experience which I want to share with you that has to do with the subject of Viagra, and that's why the Viagra is in the title. Again, this is about the double standard, about why technologies that seem to have something to do with male sexuality are more, in some strange way, respectable than things having to do with female sexuality. One of the strange phone calls that I got in the last 18 months was from a delightful gentleman, a European, named Philippe Woog, Dr. Philippe Woog of Geneva, Switzerland, who called me one day, to my great surprise. There might be people out there in the audience who are old enough to remember Broxident toothbrushes. Maybe not many. I don't see any lights going on. There used to, one of the earliest electric toothbrushes was made by a Swiss company called Broxo. And Philippe Woog is the administrator of this company. Now, back in the 60s, the 1960s, when I was still a young sprout, like most of you, sex therapists were just at that time beginning to think about women's sexuality in the way that they now do, which is that it is somewhat different from male sexuality. And they were beginning to prescribe soft bristle electric toothbrushes to their anorgasmic female clients. Well, Broxo, being, you know, a far, you know, a company with vision, said, well, we know how to make things that, you know, that vibrate, and we just put you, it's basically the same technology. You just put a different, as it were, vibratode, an applicator on the same kind of device, and you have a vibrator. So they are now the people who make the Aerosolator, which is the only vibrator that is endorsed by Ruth Westheimer, Dr. Ruth Westheimer. And of course, they tell you that right up front. They have a video where she endorses it, and they even sent me a free one. You know, and these things cost $100. These are upscale devices with a complete set of vibratodes in this little carrying case. It was really very nice of them. But the story the guy told me was even better than the free merchandise. He had come to the United States with the intention of buying advertising because, of course, everybody wants into the United States market. This is a great market. I mean, people here have lots of disposable income. They love gadgets. And he figured, well, you know, there's lots of American women that want to buy vibrators, and we know this because they're buying them. And surely there must be some that want an upscale one, and I want to go and advertise to them in upscale publications and on television and so on. Well, most of you probably know that you recognize you've never seen a vibrator ad on TV, and there's a good reason for that. That's because they don't allow them on TV in the United States. And I don't know whether that's the FCC that does that or whether it's self-censorship by the stations, but you just don't, you're not even, it's considered disreputable even to discuss vibrators on television, although I understand that on some of the sleazier talk shows it's okay. But you don't see vibrator ads, which, as you will see, is something of a change from the earlier part of this century. He was particularly interested in advertising in Cosmopolitan, Glamour, Vogue, and other upscale women's magazines of that kind. And he thought that they would be receptive because they all accept advertising for Viagra, right? He had the ads. He said, oh, okay, well, you know, this must be okay because here are these ads for Viagra. And they wouldn't take his money. Now, this was a great shock. You know, if you live in Europe, you think that you could buy anything in the United States. We're supposed to be that kind of country, right? Money talks. Well, not if you're talking about women's sexuality. So he asked them, what's supposed to be wrong with this? Why? You know, I mean, Ruth Westheimer is you know, among other things, a marriage counselor. I mean, what's supposed to be wrong with what used to be called a marital aid? You know, that this is something that couples buy, you know, so that they can enjoy their sex lives more. I mean, what's supposed to be the matter with it? And they said, well, you know, that's not the way the vibrator is perceived in this country. The reason that we have Viagra ads is that Viagra enables a man to have sex with a woman, and that's fine. But a vibrator enables a woman to have sex by herself, and we can't endorse that. So he couldn't buy advertising here, and he wanted to know, could I help? Well, of course, I couldn't. I mean, maybe I'm helping by telling this story, but of course, it's to me, it's such an interesting story about how persistent what I call the androcentric model of sexuality is. Most of you already know what the androcentric model of sexuality is. You just probably never heard it called by that. It is coitus, intercourse, penetration of the vagina by the penis to male orgasm. And all of us learned in high school, at least those of us who are my age, learned in high school that that was real sex and nothing else was. And of course, in this past decade, we have also learned that this is the Bill Clinton model of what real sex is, that this is the kind of sex that he didn't have with Monica Lewinsky. That if this doesn't happen, then there's been no sex. Now, there's a problem about this, which is that it is not an efficient method of producing orgasm in women. The penetration alone is not a particularly efficient or effective method of producing female orgasm in about 70% of the population. There's about a third, 30%. Some studies show a little more, some show a little less. That's fairly robust back into the 19th century, and we have sort of anecdotal figures before that this has been going on for a long time, that penetration just really isn't all that big a deal for women. It doesn't work all that well. Now, as to why that should be from a reproductive physiology point of view, I have not a clue. I'm an historian, and I hope the biologists will have something figured out. There's a lot of research going on that very subject right now, and some of the things they're churning out seem wildly unlikely, but I mean, maybe they're true. I mean, what do I know? I'm not a biologist. But anyway, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of this model or paradigm, the norm of sexuality, which I call the androcentric model, because of course it does two things. First of all, it produces orgasm in nearly all men, which if you're a man, that's highly desirable. I mean, you don't meet a whole lot of men who have like ongoing sexual relationships in which they never have orgasms. It doesn't seem to be like a popular type of relationship for men. But you do meet a lot of women in which they have ongoing sexual relationships in which they never have orgasms within that relationship. Women are much more tolerant of that, partly because they've been told that they have to be. And what the other reasons might be, I'm sure I don't know, but it certainly does look as if that's one of the things that's going on. Women have also bought into this notion of this androcentric model of sexuality, partly because I think, as we're going to see as we get further along here, medicine in the past has endorsed this model, and one of its perhaps most famous or notorious proponents has been Sigmund Freud, who said that women were abnormal or infantile if they didn't learn to have orgasm in this way. And then we have had, since then, we've had Masters and Johnson, who basically said the same thing. They said, well, we'll just throw out the 70% of the data that show that women don't have orgasms with penetration, and we'll keep the 30% that do, and we'll call those the norm, and then we'll take those numbers and apply them to all the rest of the population. This is science. The first clue that there was something wrong with this picture, there had been clues right along, but the first, the women's movement, of course, was a big help. The women began to think about these things in new ways in the 60s and 70s, and Cheryl Hite came along in 1976 and published the Hite Report on Female Sexuality, where she jumped up and down and screamed about this. And in fact, life was made so difficult for her that she now no longer lives in the United States, which I think is a loss to the United States. A very, very courageous person, a history graduate student. She's ABD in history from Columbia. Not many people know that. But in any case, she's one who talked about it. Kinsey noticed it and had some very pointed things to say about it that nobody wanted to hear. Poor soul, he really he had his funding taken away from him in part because of the things he said about women's sexuality, which nobody wanted to hear. Alfred Kinsey is the author of the Kinsey Report, for those of you who are too young to remember Kinsey. And he was considered a controversial figure in his day. He probably wouldn't be quite so controversial now. Now I'm going to move on to sort of the substance of the research that I did and tell you a little about my adventures. One of the things that Alan didn't tell you was that I got fired from, you mentioned that I worked for Clarkson University. I got fired from Clarkson University, partly because I was doing this research. They were afraid the alumni would stop giving money to the school. And they also, they had some other complaints about me. They said I had a very high energy level that wasn't compatible with the rest of the faculty. And I had other defects as well, I'm sure. But in any case, they really did not think this was a good thing to have associated with Clarkson University, this vibrator stuff. What I'm going to talk about is a disease paradigm that has been around since Hippocrates and that was treated as a disease by doctors until well into this century. Doctors stopped using vibrators to treat it in the 20s, and the disease paradigm itself was dropped from the list of official medical paradigms by the American Psychiatric Association in the 1950s. And that disease paradigm is hysteria. Now, we all have heard of hysteria, right? In Greek, it comes from a Greek word meaning uterus. It comes from hyster, which means uterus. And it was, from the time of Hippocrates forward, thought to be a disease of the uterus, that it was caused by something that was bad that was happening to the uterus, either fumes rising from it, or in the case, some physicians thought that the uterus itself, was, in fact, Plato says this, he thought of the womb as an animal within an animal, and that it would it would get loose and it would start crawling around in the body and come up with a throat choker, and he thought it was a real problem. Now, those of you who look at an anatomy textbook, that really it's very securely fastened to the abdominal walls, and it really doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't crawl down her arm. I mean, it's not, some of these things sound like really weird science fiction, and it really, you could probably do something with that if you're a science fiction writer. And I'm going to talk about some of the treatments for this so-called disease. I am going to suggest that many of the cases of hysteria, probably not all of them, but at least a fair number of them, were actually cases of women who were sexually frustrated because they lived in a society in which the androcentric model of sexuality was the norm. Women were not supposed to masturbate because that was supposed to be bad for them too, but it was okay to go to the doctor and be treated. So here we have, in 1653, Peter van Foreest, called Alamarianus Petrus Forestus, publishing a medical compendium in which he describes a treatment for what he calls praefocatio metricus, which is one of the many names for hysteria that appear in medical history. And he says, "When these symptoms indicate, we think it necessary to ask a midwife to assist, so that she can massage the genitalia with one finger inside, using oil of lilies, muskroot, crocus, or something similar. And in this way, the afflicted woman can be aroused to the paroxysm. This kind of stimulation with the finger is recommended by Galen and Avicenna, among others, most especially for widows, those who live chaste lives, and female religious. As Gradus, Ferrari de Gradi, proposes, it is less often recommended for very young women, public women, or married women, for whom it is a better remedy to engage in intercourse with their spouses. So here we have a medical treatment, which is treated as a matter of, is discussed as a matter of well-established medical knowledge in 1653, for which intercourse is a substitute. So it seems one would say, well, you know, there must be something sexual going on. But since there's no penetration of the vagina by the penis to male orgasm, it's not sex. So keep that in mind. This is not supposed to be sex. And that's how the doctors are getting away with this, obviously. And that's one of the reasons. Well, what are these guys treating? And who are these? First of all, who are these guys? They're mostly guys that we from whom we have testimony, although starting in the Renaissance, we have some testimony from midwives to the effect that they provided this service as well. And of course, Van Foreest here suggests that midwives were called in by doctors for this very purpose. Some of the people who wrote about this are not obscure. Hippocrates, I've already mentioned. Most people have heard of him. Celsus, very famous guy. William Harvey, the guy who discovered the circulation of the blood. Most of the people who read Harvey don't read the part about the massage to orgasm. They read the part about the circulation of the blood, which is his most famous stuff. But nevertheless, he wrote about this too. Thomas Sydenham, very famous physician also. All of them wrote about this, and for some reason, there have been only 2 previous historians that have written about it. And I don't think this can be a coincidence. They're both women. Audrey Eccles in Obstetrics and Gynecology in Tudor and Stuart, England, and Ilse Weith's History of Hysteria. And she just mentions that, both of them mention it very briefly, and then they move on. But it was definitely known that this is what was going on. We have another description of it from Rivierius, which I will... Lazare Riviere lived from, who's called Rivierius, these people all wrote in Latin, lived from 1589 to 1655, and he wrote of hysteria, "The womb fury," which is another of its many names, "is a sort of madness arising from a vehement and unbridled desire of carnal embracement, which desire disthrones the rational faculties so far that the patient utters wanton and lascivious speeches. Although it mainly affects virgins and young widows, it may also betide married women that have impotent husbands, or such as they do not much affect, whereby their seminary vessels are not sufficiently disburthened." Women were thought to have seminary vessels too. "If marriage fails as a remedy, some advise that the genital part should be by a cunning midwife so handled and rubbed so as to cause an evacuation of the overabounding sperm." Now, what this clearly emphasizes is the Galenic theory behind all this. Now, I don't know how many of you heard of Galenic medicine, but this is the notion that there were 4 humors or liquids in the body, and that you had to have them in balance. And if you had too much of one, some of it had to be let out. And it was thought that the seminal fluids in both men and women, they were thought to be parallel, had to be evacuated at regular intervals. And what was the obvious way to do this? What would produce moisture in the appropriate region of the body? Well, obviously, orgasm in women produces at least some moisture, usually. And this was thought to be a help. But hysteria was chronic and incurable. So you had to go back to the doctor regularly. Now, what were the symptoms of this supposed disease? Well, pelvic congestion was one, nervousness, insomnia, sensations of heaviness or fullness in the abdomen, shortness of breath, heavy breathing, and my own 2 personal favorites, vaginal lubrication and sexual fantasy. Now, if these were disease symptoms, it's not very surprising they found a lot of sick people. You know, if you're a doctor and you're out there diagnosing people, and do you ever have vaginal lubrication, sexual fantasy? Yeah. So I was hysteric. It'd be very easy to find patients that way, I would suppose. Now, the causes, as I have already suggested, were supposed to be lack of sex. And of course, that's why they're prescribing coitus with husbands when there are husbands. Sometimes that doesn't work, and the doctors notice that. And then some of them kind of speculate that actually what's going on is a lack of gratification, that is a lack of orgasm. not a lack of sex. Although some of them stick right to their theories that, well, actually, it's the male seminal fluid that causes, is healthy for women, and that the swelling of the abdomen is reduced by this soothing liquid, blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't matter whether a woman has an orgasm or not, right? It's a convenient excuse anyway. Freud, his hypothesis was not that there were fluids that needed to be released, but that there were things going on in your brain that needed to be released, and that it was bad not to have orgasm for that reason. So what I'm suggesting here is that this androcentric model produced a condition, a social condition, in which a normal condition of female sexuality was diagnosed as a disease so that it could be medicalized. It could be treated as a medical problem. It did not have to be treated as a larger cultural problem that would have necessitated a redefinition of sexuality. It would have necessitated a change from what I'm calling the androcentric model. There were some doctors, there were a few, who did say we need to think about women, stimulating women the way that actually works for them. But there were not a lot, because one of the things that the androcentric model does for you is that it promotes pregnancy, which was a religious desideratum as well as, in many cases, a personal one. And of course, stimulation with the finger, as Gradus and others proposed, did not have that result. Now, you may wonder, as a lot of people do, how in the world did otherwise a perfectly respectable historian, get interested in such a subject? Well, the answer sounds very innocuous. I was interested in needlework. And I was doing research on crochet and tatting and knitting and so forth at the turn of this century. And the magazines from that era, there's no index to them. There's no like Reader's Guide to Needlework periodicals. The only way to find anything in them is just to page through them one page at a time. And I don't know if you've ever looked at magazines from the teens and the 20s, but the advertising in them is so interesting. For one thing, there was no Federal Drug Administration then, so there's all these cures for alcoholism, and you look at it and they're like 90 proof, and there's all these these drugs that you could buy. You could buy abortifacients through the mail, except they weren't called abortifacients; they were called cycle restorers. Are you late? I'll show you one of those ads, in fact, in a minute. So I began to wonder. I started when I was looking through these, and I kept seeing vibrator ads. And I thought, no, I must just have a dirty mind, because these look like modern vibrators. And they're, all these ads are being pitched to women. And I'm thinking, And I started reading them, and I thought, well, I wonder why they're so early. 1906 was one of the ones I saw. The earliest one I've seen is 1899. And I was enough interested at that point already in the history of technology to see that this is very early for any electrical device in the home. In fact, you will not be surprised to hear it is, in fact, the fifth electrical appliance to be introduced into the home. They are, in order, the sewing machine, the fan, the tea kettle, the toaster, and the vibrator. Woman does not live by toast alone. So I was very curious then, once I found out how early it was, I said, well, there must be some reason. Notice, by the way, that the iron doesn't get invented until like 10 years later. The dishwasher, much later. It's the first personal care. The hairdryer is later. So it's very interesting what kind of priorities it reflects. It's kind of hard to say what was really going on in people's minds, but nevertheless, their priorities suggest that this was an early one. I wanted to know who invented it and why. What did they think they were doing when they invented this device? What did the engineers who designed it and built it, what did they think they were doing? And who did they think was the market? So I started doing research on that, and I went out to Minneapolis to the Bakken Library and Museum of Electricity in Life, which is a wonderful collection of medical electricity. Anyone interested in the uses of electricity in medicine, you got to go there. It's a great place. And learned that the vibrator was invented by doctors. The modern electromechanical vibrator was in fact invented by Joseph Mortimer Granville, who was an English doctor, who thought it was immoral to use it on women, especially hysterics. He doesn't say why. He just says, don't do that. But people ignored him in droves. Doctors were the first market for vibrators. And they were, in fact, as you'll see, there were lots of models invented for them, amazing number of them invented by about 1910. But along, as I've also suggested, a large number of them began to appear after 1900 as consumer devices, and eventually doctors lost control of the device. Now, one may wonder how the doctors got away with this, treating women treating women who had this supposed hysterical disorder by producing orgasm, first with their bare hands, later with various hydropathic devices, some of which I'll show you. And then there were even wind-up vibrators, like clockwork vibrators, in the early 19th century, but they had a tendency to wind down at the wrong moment. And so doctors didn't like those very much. Doctors didn't like those very much. And then there were battery-powered ones, but these were wet cell batteries, big, heavy, monstrous things that the doctors had to lug around and keep filled up with water, and they didn't like that either. The coal-fired vibrator was somehow all you have to do is mention that and people laugh. I mean, it is a very funny. It's a steam-powered, coal-fired vibrator. But the doctors didn't like that one either because, first of all, it took up a lot of space and it was kind of noisy. But also you had to shovel coal into it all the time. So that one usually was used in spas and not, doctors didn't install it in their offices because it was too cumbersome and it was too much work. So some of these doctors seem to have known what they were doing. That is, knew that they were producing orgasm for payment. Now, when you think of a group in our society that produces orgasm for payment, the first thing that comes to mind usually isn't doctors. But some of them, we have Highmore writing in 1660 that what is being produced in this treatment, which the doctors usually call hysterical paroxysm, is simply an orgasm, and that he just says that. He calls it that in Latin. He says it's orgasmum, which only has one meaning. It's not an ambiguous word. But hysterical paroxysm is pretty, the idea was you would produce the crisis of a disease. You know how in Galenic medicine, when the fever broke, you're supposed to bring on the breaking of the fever because after that the patient would start to recover. Well, the idea of producing this hysterical paroxysm was that it induced a crisis of the disease and then the patient would feel better for a while. But as I've said, of course, this disease was incurable and chronic, so these were great patients. They're not going to recover from this so-called disease, and they're not going to die of it either. They're just going to have to keep going back to the doctor. So it's like the ideal disease. It's kind of a shame that doctors can't diagnose it anymore. One of the things that I would like to say, though, is there's no evidence that doctors liked doing this job. They regarded it as a chore. They were definitely looking for some mechanism that would relieve them of this chore, this task, which some of them complained took up to an hour to accomplish. And in fact, Natalie Angier, who is the author of Woman, An Intimate Geography, which some of you may have seen, suggested to me that maybe the doctors were suffering from carpal tunnel syndrome from all of this massage. So that they didn't particularly want to do it, and that's why they brought in midwives. That's why they used these hydriatic devices that you'll see, and of course later the electromechanical vibrator. So what was really wrong with these women? Well, some of them may really have been sick. I mean, some of them have actually had, like real organic things wrong with them. But I am suggesting that a great many of them were simply suffering from frustration. Hysteria was legislated out of existence by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. But we still have, as you have seen, we still have the androcentric model with us. As recently as 1995, Cosmopolitan magazine, which is probably politically incorrect in any case, but whatever, it's popular enough that people do read it. I mean, it's out there, people read it. In 1995, they actually recommended in an article that women fake orgasm in penetration because this is what men expected and it would avoid a lot of arguments. So let no one say that the androcentric model is dead or that the double standard is dead. This is, I realize, a different use from the one that we grew up with of the expression double standard. But women's sexuality is still not treated on a par with male sexuality. Is what I am arguing there, and I'm arguing that arousal was pathologized and treated as hysteria. And that orgasm probably did make these women feel better. You know, the first thing that doctors are supposed to do in the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. And certainly this did them no harm. And compared with some of the other medical procedures in medical history, I don't know how much of you have studied any medical history, but you don't have to study very much of it to conceive a real horror of some of the things that, like, you know, in 1850, half of all surgical patients died. I mean, that, you know, this was not that kind of thing. You know, these women were really quite fortunate in that this was a completely benign medical treatment, unlike, say, bleeding and some of the other things that doctors did. Ergot for pregnancy. Okay, now the moment you've all been waiting for, the pictures. Now, can we lower the lights in the auditorium? And I've got light up here, so. We know that the, see, how about these here? Can we kill them too? Ah, there we go. Now we're cooking. Okay. We've already talked about the manual method, which is mentioned not only in Hippocrates, but in other ancient authors. It appears in Aretius Cappadox and in Juvenal, who mentions it as something that happens in the massage rooms of Roman baths. Women would go. He has a long satire against women. It's in fact his longest satire, and he mentions women going to the baths and being massaged to orgasm by male masseurs. This is the Hydriatic method. This was this was about 1860 in France. Now the French were somewhat unusual in that they would depict women in this very undignified posture. Most of the pictures that you're going to see actually don't show women being treated with these devices. There was a convention that you showed men being treated, but then in the text you'd say, well, really, this is something that's used more for women. But it was considered improper. But the French didn't care about improper, or at least these didn't. This particular French spa wanted to, like, you know, as it were, cut to the chase and tell you what you were going to get when you went there. This was known as the abdominal douche or the pelvic douche, and it was. Most of you probably know that the mean time to orgasm in masturbation for both sexes is just a few seconds over 4 minutes, and this was supposed to be used on women for 4 to 5 minutes. That was the expected length of time to produce the treatment. Sometimes they felt like you ought to be warmed up a little. This woman here, this is at Saratoga, New York, in the 19th century, and they've got this woman wrapped in a wet sheet, and they're flogging her with a wet towel, you know, just to kind of stimulate the circulation before they give her the douche. This was another device that I thought was sort of promising, so I put it in my slides. This is the ascending douche, another of these things that you would mainly find this at spas. Although some doctors had little hydrotherapeutic spas in their offices, but most of the time you had to go to one. This was another device that proved not as successful as the vibrator, but it was a predecessor to it. This is the jolting chair. This is an actual one in the Potsdam Public Museum, where, in fact, to this day you can go if you feel like driving to New York State. You can go there and sit down in it, and you pull back on those handles, and you're jounced up and down on your pelvis. Now, it didn't do a thing for me, but you're welcome to go and try it yourself. This is an early hybrid model vibrator. That is, it is both an electrotherapeutic device and a vibrator. That is that roller on the right-hand side vibrates, but it also gives you a mild electrical shock, which was thought to be desirable. Now, in the 19th century, you know, they were very worried about masturbation. We don't know how much people masturbated in the 19th century, but we know that doctors thought about it night and day. For both sexes. I mean, they really worried about it. In fact, there's a wonderful book which I warmly recommend by Nicholas Cook called Satan in Society, which has a chapter each on male masturbation and female masturbation, including a description of a guy who supposedly dies of masturbation with this final whole body orgasm that goes on for like 20 minutes. And then, you know, I thought it was like, wow, what a way to go. I don't know what was really wrong with him, but the doctor said that it was masturbation that did it. So here we have a guy who's recharging himself after having lost some of his masculine, as it were, virtue through masturbation. So he's getting recharged with this electrotherapeutic vibrator that we just saw in the previous slide. Electricity is supposed to be very good for that. This is you can't see this very well, I realize that. This is an electromedical institute where you can have all of these treatments done to you. Down here in the lower left, we have the douche therapy that you saw earlier. We have plunge baths. We have hot rooms. And you notice here again, this is an American, in fact, it's St. Paul, an American institution, so you don't see the women with their clothes off. But you see that they have, in big letters, a special department for females. Watch this space. And you see the women, well, actually I think you have a woman in this bath over here, but you can't see her very well. And that's common. There's an issue of propriety about the advertising. This is the electromechanical vibrator, the first one that I am aware of in 1883. This is the one that's by Joseph Mortimer Granville. It was manufactured for him by Weiss, which is still a famous maker of medical instruments. This is the battery. And it was about this big. It was a real monster, and it was full of water. These were some of the vibratodes, the various applicators. That, by the way, is the term that was used at the time, vibratode. We would probably now call them attachments or something like that, but at the time they were called vibratodes on the model of electrodes. This is the actual vibrator. This is in Minneapolis. This is at the Bakken Library and Museum of Electricity and Life. And as you can see, the parts were mainly brass and metal, some leather. Nowadays, vibrators are mostly made of plastic with some metal. Excuse me. But they haven't changed a whole lot in the way that they operate. Basically, those of you who are engineers probably already figured out they're basically just, all motors vibrate. Electrical motors, they all vibrate. Well, if you make a sloppy motor, it'll vibrate more. So you just put a sloppy motor in the thing. And of course it vibrates, right? It's very easy to produce as far as the technology is concerned. Here is another one of these sort of hybrid devices. This is the electrospatter. This was a doctor's model. Now this thing, it looks like a cross between an old-fashioned telephone and a visitor from outer space. Actually was a multiplexed device. Over here on the left we have the vibratory side. And this device on the right-hand side actually provided both suction and hot air. So you could either, as it were, blow or suck on one side, and you had a vibrator on the other. So you could answer a variety of needs with one device. This sort of a control mechanism down here at the bottom was how you turned up the speed. These little pearl buttons here, you would just turn this thing over this way toward the right to sort of turn it up. I thought that was a really nice. This was Victor. Victor made a number of these different kinds of devices. You'll see some more here. This is another Victor item. This is one, in fact, that they used to use this in the mechanotherapy room of the baths at Hot Springs, Arkansas. And when the National Park Service began restoring hot springs, the poor curator that was assigned the job of restoring the rooms had to go from antique dealer to antique dealer trying to find one of these. This is a woman, at that time she was about 30, she's going from antique to, do you have any old vibrators? I think they finally got it done. I think they finally found one. This monstrosity here, the Chattanooga vibrator, is a personal favorite of mine. I've never seen one, a real one, that is, one that's still around. This thing cost $200 in 1904 at a time when you could buy a small house for $300. That was plus freight, and it weighed a ton. The top part is the part with the round thing. The round thing is the actual motor that vibrates. The box is a counterweight because the whole thing is so heavy that it would fall right over if it weren't for that counterweight. And you can see it's on casters so that you can wheel it around to use in your vibratory operating room, of which I know I have a slide here somewhere. Oh yeah, here we go. Here you can see it in use. The doctor has got a hold of the handles that are right sort of in front of the vibrating mechanism. Here we see it used on the abdomen, but of course, as I've told you, there's a convention to use men in these ads. And the device, yes, that's right. It tells you all about what it is and what it does. And they're very careful. You notice they're very careful to tell you that it is an ornament to a physician's office, that people will be impressed merely by the sight of this object, not only by its action, but also because it looks like a medical instrument. And then it tells you it is not unprofessional, it is not sold to barbers, masseurs, or the laity. See, they wanted to make it very clear this is not the kind of vibrator that you could buy at Sears. And if you could buy vibrators at Sears at this point, as you will see. Now, some of the vibratodes that were available were quite impressive. This is an array of them. I think that my own personal favorite is the 10-inch rectal vibratode that was used to treat constipation. And my theory of how it worked was that they just showed it to you. This was another model that was belonged at one time to a chiropractor. You can't see this very well. Here's a hard rubber ball vibratode, which you can still buy on vibrators. And in fact, these devices here all look very much like modern vibratodes. This is beginning to look like the modern vibrator. This was a physician's model, but very similar models were available to consumers by about 1905. Here are some more medical models, and as you can see, some of them had electrodes. And here we have one that comes with its own battery that was used on house calls. Now, I have wondered a lot about those house calls, but unfortunately, I have no information, so one can merely speculate. There was no shortage of literature